authorization. Never thought you'd make it. Nothing stops authorization. How you boys doing? Better now that you're here.
On December 22, 1944, four German officers carrying a white flag approached the American lines outside the Belgian town of Bastogne. They were emissaries from General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, which had the 101st Airborne Division surrounded in the town. They carried a written message demanding surrender. The message was formal, correct in tone, almost respectful. It acknowledged the brave fighting of the American soldiers and offered them an honorable way out of a situation that the German commander had described as hopeless. The message was delivered to the American commander in Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony Clem McAuliffe, who had been awakened from sleep to receive it. He read it. He thought about it for a moment. He said something along the lines of, nuts. Then he went back to more pressing matters. The immediate tactical situation of a besieged garrison that had been surrounded for 4 days, that was running low on ammunition, that had no adequate medical supplies, and that was facing German forces that outnumbered it substantially on every side. His staff, recognizing that some kind of written response was required to the German emissaries who were waiting for an answer, asked him what to say. McAuliffe looked at them and said, "Well, I don't know what to tell them," and then suggested that the response he had already given was probably adequate. One of his officers, accounts differ about who, suggested that nuts was as good an answer as any. McAuliffe wrote it down. Nuts. One word, capitalized on a plain sheet of paper. His aide carried it to the German emissaries and handed it to them. The Germans, perplexed, asked for a translation or clarification of the American response. The aide, accounts identify him as Colonel Joseph Harper, told them that it meant the same as the two words "go to hell," and that they had better be paying attention to what was coming from the south and to start defending themselves. Patton was coming. That is the famous story. The word, the defiance, the dramatic arrival of the relief column. It has been told in books and films and documentaries for 80 years, and it has become one of the most recognizable single moments of the American war experience in Europe, the image of American courage and American stubbornness expressed in a single syllable. What the famous story tends to leave out is the specific human content of what the word cost. The cost paid by the men in the foxholes in the Ardennes snow. The cost paid by the men of Patton's relief column, who fought through Bastogne. The cost paid by the civilians of Bastogne, who lived through the siege, and the specific cost that McAuliffe himself paid for giving the answer that defined his military career in a way that he found, in some respects, less than entirely satisfying. This is the final episode of this series. It tells the story of Bastogne completely, not just a famous word, but the full human account of what the siege required and what it cost. And it does so as a way of honoring the specific tradition this series has tried to maintain throughout. That the famous moments of the war were made by specific people in specific circumstances, and that the full truth of what those moments meant requires knowing the specific circumstances as completely as we can. Before the story begins, I want to ask you one last time. If you've been watching this series and you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. This is the last episode of the series, and the like and the subscription together are the things that tell the algorithm this series deserves to be shown to people who haven't found it yet. Every subscriber and every like matters more at the end of the series than at any other point. If any episode of this series has given you something, has made you understand something about the war that you didn't understand before, subscribe and like this episode and share it with someone who should watch it. Back to Bastogne, back to the word and the siege and what it actually cost. The specific legacy of the Battle of the Bulge in American military culture, the way the battle has been remembered, commemorated, and used as a touchstone for American military values, is worth examining because it illuminates how the nuts response became the symbol it became and what the symbol is actually expressing. The Bulge was, for the American Army, a specific kind of test, a test of whether American soldiers could respond effectively to a situation of crisis and surprise, whether the American military establishment had produced fighters who could hold under conditions of extreme pressure, and whether the specific virtues of the American soldier, the initiative, the adaptability, the refusal to accept defeat, were real or simply the product of the favorable conditions of most of the American armies. European campaign. The answer the bulge provided was unambiguous. The American soldiers who were hit by the German offensive in December 1944 were, in many cases, green troops or resting divisions that had been placed in a quiet sector precisely because they were not considered ready for the kind of intense combat that the frontline sectors required. Yet they fought, not all of them, and not always effectively. Some units broke, some officers failed. Some positions were overrun in ways that reflected confusion and the surprise of the initial assault. But in aggregate, and in the specific case of the critical road junctions and the critical positions that the German plan required, the American soldiers held. The nuts response became the symbol of this quality, the concentrated expression of the American refusal to accept the situation that the German offensive had created. It was a military response, but it was also a cultural response, an expression of something that Americans recognized as distinctively their own about how they expected their soldiers to behave when the pressure was at its maximum. The specific media coverage of the bulge, the press dispatches that described the German offensive, the coverage of the Bastogne siege, the dramatic announcement of the relief, created a public narrative of the battle that emphasized exactly this quality: the surrounded garrison, the defiant answer, the cavalry arriving to save the day. It was a narrative that fit a specifically American story, and it was told with a specific emotional register of a nation that was watching its army fight and wanted to believe in what it was seeing. The post-war cultural production about the bulge, the films and the books and the television series that have kept the battle in the public memory for 80 years, have maintained and amplified this narrative. The most recent and most widely seen of these productions is the HBO series Band of Brothers, which follows the men of the 101st Airborne's E Company from their training through Bastogne and beyond. The Bastogne episodes of Band of Brothers are among the most watched television depictions of World War II combat ever produced, and they have been the primary means through which a generation of viewers has encountered the Bastogne story. Band of Brothers is, on the whole, a serious and historically grounded production that tries to honor the specific human experience of the men it depicts. Its Bastogne episodes capture something real about the cold and the shortage and the specific quality of a unit holding under conditions of extreme difficulty. But it is also a production that, by its narrative focus on a specific small unit, necessarily simplifies the full complexity of the battle that Bastogne was. The full story of the civilian population, the full story of the attached units that fought alongside the 101st, the full story of what the relief operation required of the men of Patton's Third Army. The specific soldiers of E Company whose story Band of Brothers tells are real people whose specific courage and specific sacrifice deserve the attention the series has given them. The broader story of Bastogne, the full human account of everyone who was in town and around it in December 1944, is larger than any single production can contain. McAuliffe is a peripheral figure in Band of Brothers, appearing briefly in the Bastogne episodes for a specific scene of the nuts response. The scene captures the moment accurately enough, but it cannot convey the full context, the 8 days of siege, the specific decisions that McAuliffe made in managing the garrison's defense, the relationship between the famous word and the sustained military competence that made the word more than empty defiance. The sustained military competence is the less dramatic story, but the more important one. McAuliffe managed a besieged garrison in conditions of extreme difficulty, with a calm professionalism that the dramatic moment of a nuts response tends to overshadow. He made the specific operational decisions about the deployment of the perimeter, the management of the ammunition, the coordination of the defense that allowed the garrison to hold for 8 days until Patton arrived. The word was one moment in 8 days of continuous command performance, and the continuous command performance was what made the word meaningful. This is a specific lesson that the Bastogne story teaches about military leadership, and that this series has tried to illustrate across 20 episodes in various specific forms. The famous moments are real and they matter. They are, however, the distillation of sustained qualities that the famous moments themselves cannot fully convey. Eisenhower's "okay, we'll go" was a moment, but it was made possible by 40 years of building toward it. Nimitz's decision to trust the code was a moment, but it was made possible by the specific command culture he had created and the specific relationships with his intelligence staff that made trusting the code possible. McAuliffe's nuts was a moment, But it was made possible by the specific quality of the garrison he commanded and the specific operational decisions he had been making for 8 days before the German emissaries arrived. The men in the foxholes at Bastogne held the perimeter, not because their general said nuts. They held it because they were the soldiers. They were trained, motivated, led, and capable of performing under conditions that the war had required them to face. The nuts was the expression of their quality, not its cause. This distinction between the expression and the cause, between the symbol and the substance, is a distinction that this series has tried to maintain across all 20 episodes. The symbols are real. The substance is more important. The famous names are real. The specific people who made the famous names possible are more important. The famous moments are real. The sustained effort and the sustained quality that made the famous moments possible are more important. The Second World War was won by specific people doing specific things in specific places under specific conditions. The full truth of how it was won, the full truth of what it cost and what required the people who fought it, is a truth that no series can fully contain. But it is a truth that deserves to be approached as completely as possible, with a specific attention to the specific human beings that the specific facts require. That is what this series has tried to do. From Eisenhower in the rain at Southwick House to McAuliffe in the snow at Bastogne. 20 episodes, 20 commanders, 20 specific moments that illuminate the specific qualities of the specific people who determine the outcome of the most destructive conflict in human history. They deserve to be known. They deserve to be remembered. And the specific soldiers whose specific courage made each of these famous moments possible. They deserve most of all to be remembered as the human beings they were, not as the abstractions of history, but as the specific people who held the specific perimeter in the specific snow of the specific December, the specific year that the world was asking everything of them. The word was one syllable. The holding was 8 days. The price was real, and the soldiers paid it. That is the Bastogne story. That is the Nuts War, and that is where the series ends. The broader context of the Battle of the Bulge, the full German offensive of December 1944 and January 1945, provides a framework within which the Bastogne story must be understood, and it illuminates both the strategic significance of what McAuliffe and the 101st accomplished and the specific reasons why the decision to hold Bastogne was not simply an act of courage, but an act of strategic intelligence. Hitler's plan for the Ardennes offensive, Operation Watch on the Rhine, was, in the specific view of most of the senior commanders, an act of strategic irresponsibility. Germany in December 1944 was losing the war on every front. The Western Allies had liberated France and Belgium and were approaching Germany's western border. The Soviet Union's winter offensive was being planned and would be launched in January. Germany's oil supply had been severely disrupted by Allied strategic bombing. The Wehrmacht's manpower reserves were depleted. The replacement system was increasingly unable to keep pace with casualties, and the equipment that the American and Soviet industrial systems were producing in the final year of the war was approaching a level of material superiority that no amount of German military professionalism could fully offset. Field Marshal Walter Model and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commanders in the West, had presented alternatives to the offensive that they believed were more consistent with Germany's actual military capacity, a limited counterattack designed to shorten the front and inflict casualties on the advancing Allied forces, rather than the ambitious drive Antwerp that Hitler was demanding. Hitler overruled them both. He had been emboldened by the survival of the July 20th assassination attempt, by what he believed was a historical precedent of Frederick the Great's recovery from seemingly hopeless military situations, and by the specific belief that the Western alliance was politically fragile and that a major German military success might break the coalition's will to continue the war. This political calculation was wrong. The Western alliance was not politically fragile in a way that Hitler believed. The specific political tensions that existed between the Americans and the British, the persistent disputes about strategy, about command, about the allocation of resources, were real, but they were not of a character that a German military success was likely to resolve in Germany's favor. The American public's response to the Bulge, when it became known, was not to demand negotiated peace. It was to intensify the war effort. Roosevelt's public communications during the Bulge were designed to sustain the public's confidence in the outcome, and they succeeded. The German offensive achieved the initial tactical surprise that its planning had sought. The American units on the Ardennes front were overwhelmed in the first days, and the penetration that the German armor achieved, the bulge that gave the battle its name, was real and alarming. The specific crisis of the bulge, the danger that the German advance might actually achieve its objectives, or at least create a situation that would significantly delay the Allied advance, was a genuine military crisis that required an effective Allied response. The effective Allied response had two components. The first was the holding of Bastogne and Saint-Vith, the two road junctions that the German advance needed, and that the American defenders denied it. The second was Patton's counterattack on the south, the Third Army's extraordinary pivot that brought relief to Bastogne and began the process of cutting off the German salient. Together, these two components of the Allied response converted the German offensive from a potential strategic achievement into an operational failure that accelerated Germany's final defeat. The specific role of Bastogne in this outcome was the denial of the road network that the German advance required. The German commander Luttwitz, facing the American refusal to surrender Bastogne, had to divert forces to contain the garrison that he needed for the advance. The specific troops and the specific time that the containment of Bastogne consumed were troops and time that were not available for the main effort of the offensive. The price that the 101st Airborne paid for holding Bastogne was substantial. The price that Germany paid for not taking it was larger. The specific counterfactual, what the German offensive might have achieved if Bastogne had fallen, is one that the military historians have examined with some care. The consensus is that even a quick fall of Bastogne would not have allowed the German offensive to achieve its ultimate objective of reaching Antwerp. The logistics of the offensive, the Allied air power that was coming to bear as the weather cleared, and the specific quality of the American forces that were being committed to battle. These factors would have prevented the most ambitious version of the German plan, regardless of what happened at Bastogne. But Bastogne's fall would have allowed the German offensive to proceed further and faster than it did. It would have extended the time required for the Allied response to contain and reverse the penetration. It would have increased the casualties of the Battle of the Bulge, which were already enormous by any standard. And it would have delayed the Allied advance into Germany in a way that, at the margins, might have extended the war's European phase by additional weeks or months. The word that McAuliffe wrote on December 22nd, the word that his aide carried to the German emissaries who were waiting in the snow, was one factor in prevention of this outcome. Not the only factor, not even the primary factor, but a real factor in the specific causal chain that led from the German ultimatum to the continued defense to the relief to the eventual German defeat in the Bulge. The word had consequences. The consequences were significant, and the word was possible only because the men in the foxholes were there and were willing to continue holding. The specific American soldiers who held Bastogne came from every part of the United States, from every background and every economic class, from the cities and the farms and the small towns that had sent them to war. They were in their teens and their 20s. Some had been drafted. Some had volunteered. Some had arrived in England having never left their home state before, had trained for months or years, and had been dropped into France in the dark, or had ridden the trucks from Reims in December and had found themselves in Bastogne before they fully understood what was happening. The specific experience of the siege for these men, the cold, the ammunition shortage, the German attacks that came at night and in the morning fog, the specific knowledge that they were surrounded and that relief was not certain, was the experience that the word had committed them to endure. McAuliffe's nuts was not an abstraction to the private in the foxhole. It was a direct statement of the situation. No surrender, no relief yet, continue to hold. They held. Some of them died holding. Most of them survived. And the survivors carried Bastogne with them for the rest of their lives, carried the specific cold and the specific fear and the specific sound of German artillery and the specific relief when Patton's tanks came through the corridor on December 26. The memory of those who did not survive is preserved in the cemeteries of Belgium, the American Military Cemetery at Henri-Chapelle, the American Military Cemetery at the Ardennes near Liège, and the small local cemeteries where some of the men who fell in the Bulge are buried near where they fell. The names on those stones are the specific human content of what nuts men in the snow of the Ardennes in December of 1944. They are the substance of the symbol. They are the reason the word means what it means. And they deserve to be named and remembered alongside the general who wrote the word and the army that relieved the garrison, and the war that ended with their contribution made and their sacrifice paid. The Battle of the Bulge ended in late January 1945. The Allied front moved east again toward the Rhine, toward the German heartland, toward the end that came in May. The 101st Airborne continued to fight through the remainder of the war, participating in the final advance into Germany and ending the war in Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. Thousands of miles in spirit from the foxholes at Bastogne, McAuliffe commanded the division through the war's end and received the recognition that his performance deserved. He remained in the Army, served in senior commands in the post-war period, and retired with the respect of the institution he had served. The word followed him everywhere. He learned to live with it and eventually to appreciate it, to understand that the word had captured something true about who he was and what the men he commanded had been capable of, even as it simplified the full reality of what Bastogne had required. He understood in the end that simplification is how history works at the popular level, that the full story is too complex to fit in the public memory, and that the symbol that survives is the distillation of something real. Nuts was a real distillation. It captured something true. The soldiers in the snow were the substance of the truth it captured. That is the final word of the series. Not nuts, though nuts is a fine way to end story. The final word is the soldiers. Always the soldiers. The specific human beings whose specific qualities determine the outcome of the war, and who deserve to be known as completely as we can know them. That is what this series has tried to provide. The full truth, the specific people. The real cost, the soldiers in the snow. The specific men who held Bastogne. The soldiers of the 101st Airborne and the attached units that fought alongside them. Deserve individual examination because a famous word has a way of abstracting the defense into a single symbol that obscures the specific human experience of the 8 days. The 101st Airborne Division was one of the elite units of the American Army. It had been formed in 1942 and trained as an airborne division. Parachute and glider infantry, who were supposed to be inserted behind enemy lines by aircraft and who were trained for specific challenges of operating without direct ground supply or reinforcement. The training had been demanding and the selection had been competitive, and the men who had made it through had arrived at the 101st with a specific identity, a self-image as elite soldiers who could handle what ordinary infantry could not handle. This identity was not simply performance. It had been tested at Normandy, where the 101st had jumped into Normandy on the night of June 5th to 6th and had fought through the chaos of the scattered drop to achieve its D-Day objectives. It had been tested at Market Garden in September 1944, where the division had held the corridor in Holland through weeks of intense German pressure. By December 1944, the 101st was a veteran division whose specific quality, its fighting effectiveness relative to what was asked to do, had been demonstrated in conditions that left no room for illusion. The specific men who held the perimeter at Bastogne were acting within this tradition and within the specific tactical situation that McAuliffe and his staff were managing. The perimeter was organized in depth, with the defensive positions arranged to allow mutual support and prevent any single German penetration from collapsing the defense. The specific shortage of ammunition meant that the fire plan had to be managed carefully. Mortar and artillery fire was rationed, and the infantry was expected to hold their positions with small arms as much as possible. The cold was a constant and active threat. The temperature in the Ardennes in December 1944 was well below freezing, and the combination of the cold, the snow, and the specific conditions of foxhole life, the inability to move freely, the restriction of body heat by confinement in a small hole, the specific dampness that winter combat in Northern Europe produces, made frostbite and cold injury a daily reality. Men who were fully clothed and properly equipped for winter operations could manage these conditions. Men who had arrived without adequate winter clothing, as the 101st had, were managing conditions that were medically as dangerous as the German forces on the perimeter. The specific individuals who performed acts of exceptional courage during the siege, whose names appear in the after-action reports and the medal citations and the oral histories of the battle, represent the full range of military virtues that the situation demanded. Medics treating the wounded under fire, tank crew of Team de Sobry holding the Noville Road against overwhelming armored attack, artillery officers calling fire missions with the specific economy of a formation that was counting every shell. The names are in the records. The records are in the archives. The stories are there for those who look for them. The civilians of Bastogne, who were present in the town during the siege, who shared the cellars with the American wounded, who provided what assistance they could in conditions of extreme danger, are another dimension of the Bastogne story that the famous word tends to obscure. The town's civilian population had not evacuated. They were in the buildings and the cellars when the German offensive began, and they remained there through the siege, unable to leave through the German encirclement and subject to the same German artillery fire that the American garrison was enduring. The specific experience of Bastogne civilians, the fear, the cold, the specific danger of living in a town that both sides were trying to control, the relationship between the civilian population and the American soldiers who were in some sense their protectors, and in another sense the reason their town was a target, is a human story that the military history of the battle tends to treat as background. It deserves more than that. The civilians of Bastogne paid a price for the decision to hold the town that they had no voice in making. The children who spent the siege in the cellars of Bastogne, who were told to be quiet when the German patrols were close, who were given food from American rations when civilian food supply ran short, who witnessed things that children should not witness, and who carried a memory of those things into their adult lives, are part of the full story of what the word nuts actually meant in human terms. It meant that the town they were in was going to be the site of continued fighting. It meant the shells would keep falling. It meant the uncertainty would continue. It meant that the adults around them, both military and civilian, were holding on as best they could in conditions that the word had committed them to endure until Patton arrived. Patton arrived. The corridor was opened. The civilians emerged from their cellars. The wounded were evacuated. The battle continued in the surrounding area for weeks. And eventually, in late January 1945, the last German forces were pushed back to roughly the line they had held before the offensive began. And the Battle of the Bulge was over. The German offensive had failed. The specific strategic objective, the splitting of the Allied line, the capture of Antwerp, the negotiated peace that Hitler had hoped the offensive might force, had not been achieved. The offensive had, however, inflicted enormous casualties on the American forces, had demonstrated that Germany still had the capacity for major offensive operations, and had temporarily halted the Allied advance that it seemed, in the autumn of 1944, to be moving inexorably toward Germany's defeat. The delay that the Bulge imposed, the weeks that the Allied command spent dealing with the crisis rather than continuing the advance, may have been the most significant military consequence of the offensive. Whether those weeks made a significant difference to the war's timeline is a question that the historians have debated. The general view is that the Bulge delayed the final defeat of Germany by some weeks. Not enough to change the outcome, but enough to extend the suffering of the war's final months in Europe. The specific men who died in those additional weeks, killed in the fighting that the Bulge made necessary, and that would not have been necessary if the offensive had been stopped more quickly, are part of the cost of the German gamble that Hitler had made and that the defense of Bastogne had helped defeat. The word was one element of that defeat. The men in the foxholes were most of it. The specific relationship between the symbol and the substance, between the famous word and the specific human experience that the word was representing, is one of the broader themes that this series has tried to illuminate throughout its 20 episodes. The famous moment of the Second World War, Eisenhower's "Okay, we'll go," Nimitz's decision to trust the code, MacArthur's "I shall return," McAuliffe's "nuts," are real and they matter. They matter because they were real decisions made by real people in real situations, and because the decisions shaped the outcomes that the war's famous victories represent. But the decisions were made possible by the specific men and women who carried them out. The soldiers in the foxholes at Bastogne, the sailors and the carriers at Midway, the paratroopers dropping into Normandy, the soldiers of the 14th Army holding the Kohima perimeter. The symbol and the substance are inseparable. The word means nothing without the men in the snow. The men in the snow are why the word means what it means. This series has tried to hold both simultaneously, to tell the stories of the famous decisions and the famous commanders without losing sight of the specific human beings whose specific qualities made those decisions possible and whose specific lives and deaths are the real content of the history. McAuliffe said nuts. The men held the perimeter. Patton relieved the garrison. The battle continued. The war was won. And the specific people who made all of that happen, from the general who gave the famous answer to the private in the foxhole who held his position through the night, deserve to be remembered as the specific individual, irreplaceable human beings that they were. That is the Bastogne story. That is the Nuts War. And that is what this series has tried, across 20 episodes, to say about the Second World War. That the famous names and the famous moments are the surface of a deeper story. The story of specific people, specific decisions, specific costs, and that the full truth of what the war was requires going beneath the surface to find the people who made the history. The soldiers in the snow at Bastogne, the sailors at Midway, the paratroopers at Kohima, the code breakers at Bletchley Park, the workers at the arsenal of democracy, the women who kept the factories running, the men who died on the beaches and in the jungles and in the cities and in the oceans of a war that cost more human lives than any conflict in history. They deserve the full truth of what they did and what it cost them. This series has tried to provide some of it. The work is never done, but this is where the series ends. Nuts! The Battle of the Bulge. The German Ardennes offensive that began on December 16, 1944, was one of the greatest military surprises of a European war. The American intelligence services had failed to detect the concentration of German forces in the Eifel region of Germany opposite the Ardennes sector of the Allied line. The Ardennes was considered a quiet sector. The terrain was difficult. The Americans holding it were relatively inexperienced or resting divisions, and the prevailing Allied intelligence assessment held that Germany did not have a capacity to mount a major offensive in the West. Hitler did have that capacity, or something close enough to it. He had assembled 25 divisions, including several veteran Panzer divisions that had been rebuilt after the disasters of the summer, and he concealed them behind strict radio silence and careful movement discipline. The offensive that they launched on December 16th hit the American lines at their weakest point, achieved the initial breakthrough that the plan required, and within days had produced the largest crisis in the American Army's European campaign. The specific role of Bastogne in this crisis was geographic. Bastogne sat at the center of a road network that gave it control of 7 major routes through the Ardennes. An army advancing through the Ardennes needed to control Bastogne, or at least to bypass it, without leaving a garrison force that could threaten the advance's flanks and supply lines. The German plan was to capture Bastogne quickly, and then continue the advance to the Meuse and beyond. The 101st Airborne Division, which was rushed to Bastogne by truck from its rest area at Reims, arrived just in time to deny the Germans the quick capture they needed. The 101st arrived in Bastogne, beginning on December 18th, 2 days after the offensive began. They arrived without adequate winter clothing. They had been at rest, not in the line, and the specific winter equipment that the Ardennes required had not been fully available when they loaded onto the trucks. They arrived with limited ammunition. Again, the rest period meant that the full combat load was not available. They arrived to find the front collapsing around them, German units bypassing the town on both sides, and a situation in which the specific decision to hold Bastogne, rather than withdraw, was being made at multiple levels of command in real time. The decision to hold was right. The specific military logic of Bastogne as a road junction meant that giving it up would have given the German offensive a strategic advantage that the Allied command could not accept. The decision was also costly. It meant accepting a siege, accepting the losses that a siege under the conditions of the Ardennes winter would produce, and trusting that relief was possible within the time frame that the garrison could sustain. The garrison's commander was not, initially, McAuliffe. Major General Maxwell Taylor, the 101st Airborne's commanding general, had been in Washington when the offensive began, attending a conference. McAuliffe, the division's artillery commander, was the senior officer present when the division arrived at Bastogne. He assumed command by default and retained it through the siege, partly because Taylor could not reach Bastogne through the German encirclement, and partly because McAuliffe's performance in the crisis had demonstrated that he was the right person for the specific job that the situation required. The specific job was the management of a garrison under siege in conditions of extreme difficulty. Bastogne in December 1944 was cold. The winter of 1944-45 was one of the harshest in European memory, with temperatures well below freezing, heavy snow, and a specific combination of cold and wet that military medical staff identify as the ideal conditions for the non-combat casualties that could destroy a fighting force as effectively as enemy action. The men in the foxholes around Bastogne were in conditions that required constant, active management to prevent the cold from becoming operationally decisive. The ammunition shortage was real and immediate. The 101st had arrived with the combat load it had been able to assemble in the rush from Reims, and the German encirclement had prevented the resupply that would normally have replenished it. Mortar ammunition was restricted to a specific number of rounds per gun per day. Artillery ammunition was similarly rationed. The men holding the perimeter understood that there was a specific limit to how much fire support they could expect, and they adjusted their tactics accordingly. The medical situation was, in many ways, the most difficult dimension of a siege. The divisional surgeon reported within days of the encirclement that the number of wounded had exceeded the capacity of the available medical facilities, that surgical supplies were running out, and that the conditions under which the wounded were being treated, without adequate heat, without adequate lighting, without adequate drugs, were producing outcomes that would not have been acceptable in a properly supplied rear area hospital. Men who might have survived with adequate medical care did not survive under the conditions of the Bastogne siege. It was against this background, the cold, the ammunition shortage, the medical crisis, the knowledge that German forces outnumbered the garrison on every approach, that the German ultimatum arrived on December 22nd. The demand for surrender was, from a purely military standpoint, not unreasonable. The garrison was surrounded, undersupplied, facing forces that substantially outnumbered it, and in conditions that were deteriorating daily. A conventional military analysis of the situation would have supported the conclusion that the German commander was drawing. Continued resistance would only increase the cost of the defenders without changing the ultimate outcome. McAuliffe's answer rejected this analysis with a single word. The rejection was not primarily a military calculation. It was an expression of something that military culture calls esprit de corps, and that less formal language might call stubborn refusal to accept the situation. The specific quality of a fighting force that has been asked what it is made of and has answered. The 101st Airborne was the best airborne division in the American Army. Its men had jumped into Normandy on the night before D-Day. They had fought in Operation Market Garden in Holland. They were not going to surrender to the German army in a Belgian road junction because the weather was bad and the ammunition was running low. The Nuts response had immediate practical effects beyond its psychological and symbolic ones. It told the German command that the garrison would not surrender, which meant that the German forces around Bastogne could not divert their resources away from the encirclement to continue the advance. It told the Allied command that Bastogne was holding, which confirmed the strategic importance of holding it and accelerated the planning for the relief operation. And it gave the men of the garrison a specific statement of their commander's intention that they could hold on to, a clarity about what was being asked of them and what their commander's answer to the German demand had been. The relief that McAuliffe had implied was coming arrived on December 26, when elements of Patton's Third Army fought through the German encirclement south of Bastogne and opened a corridor to the garrison. The Patton story, the extraordinary speed with which the Third Army pivoted from its southward attack to the northward relief mission, the specific logistical achievement of turning an entire army 90 degrees in 48 hours, is a Patton episode of this series, and I've told it there. What the relief meant for the garrison of Bastogne was the end of the siege and the beginning of the next phase of the battle, the fighting to widen the corridor and eventually to clear the entire Bastogne area of German forces, which continued for weeks after the relief. The Battle of the Bulge was not over when the corridor to Bastogne was opened. The German offensive had been stopped but not reversed, and the fighting to push the German forces back to their start lines was grinding and costly. The 101st Airborne continued to fight around Bastogne through January 1945, in conditions that were in some respects more dangerous than the siege itself. The German forces making the corridor and surrounding area into a killing ground that produced more casualties in the weeks after the relief than the siege had produced in the week before. The total American casualties in the Battle of the Bulge were approximately 75,000 killed, wounded, and captured. The 101st Airborne share of this was substantial. The men who had held Bastogne paid a price that the famous word and the famous relief do not fully convey, a price measured in the dead and wounded of an airborne division that had been through Normandy and Holland and the Ardennes, and that emerged from the Bulge diminished in numbers and carrying the specific weight of what the siege had required of them. McAuliffe survived the war and the siege with his reputation enormously enhanced by the Nuts response. He commanded the 101st for the rest of the war and received appropriate recognition for his performance at Bastogne. He retired as a full general in 1956. He died in 1975. The specific thing about McAuliffe's post-war life that the famous story tends to obscure is the relationship between the Nuts response and his subsequent reputation. The word had defined him, had created, in one syllable, the public identity that would follow him for the rest of his life. He was, and is, primarily remembered as a man who said nuts to the Germans at Bastogne. Everything else he did in his career, his other commands, his service as the Army's representative in Europe in the 1950s, his contributions to the development of American military doctrine after the war, exists in the shadow of the single word that he said in a half-awake moment on a December morning in 1944. He had complicated feelings about this, by most accounts, not resentment. The word had been the right answer, and he understood why it mattered, but a specific kind of frustration with the way that the complexity of what he had actually done at Bastogne had been reduced to the one moment, the one word, the one image. The men who held a perimeter for 8 days in the Ardennes snow, who managed the ammunition shortage and the medical crisis in the cold, who repulsed the German attacks with the equipment and what they had available. They were part of the Bastogne story that the famous word had obscured rather than illuminated. McAuliffe's own telling of the Bastogne story, in the interviews and the accounts that he gave over the years, consistently tried to shift the focus from the word to the men who made the word possible, to the soldiers of the 101st who were in the foxholes when the German ultimatum arrived, and who were still in the foxholes when Patton's relief arrived 4 days later. He understood, with the clarity of a man who had been there, that the word was the symbol and the soldiers were the substance, and that the symbol had received more attention than the substance deserved. The men in the foxholes, the men with the ammunition shortage and the inadequate winter clothing, and the wounded who could not be properly treated. The men who received the news that their general had said nuts to the German demand for surrender and who understood, with a specific knowledge of men who were sitting in the snow in December, that nuts meant they were going to keep sitting in the snow and keep fighting and keep dying until Patton arrived or they ran out of everything they had. They did keep fighting. They did keep holding. Patton arrived. The siege was broken, and the word that had defined the moment became part of the permanent vocabulary of American military courage, a specific and exact expression of the specific quality that the men who said it, and the men who heard it, and the men who made it possible had demonstrated. Nuts. One word. One besieged garrison in the Belgian snow. One of the most complete demonstrations of what American soldiers were capable of when the situation required everything they had. And one general, half asleep on a December morning, who gave the right answer without knowing it would still be quoted 80 years later. That is the McAuliffe War. That is the Bastogne story. And that is the final episode of the series, which is tried across 20 episodes in the full sweep of the Second World War, to tell the stories that the famous names and the famous moments contain, but do not always fully express. The soldiers, the specific cost, the specific decisions, the specific human beings whose specific qualities determine the outcome of the most destructive conflict in human history. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. The men and women of the Second World War deserve to be known as completely as we can know them. This series has tried to do that. The work is never done, but this is where the series ends. Subscribe if you haven't. Share if it mattered. And remember, the soldiers in the snow at Bastogne deserve to be remembered as much as a general who said nuts. The word was one man's. The holding was everybody's. The oral history collections for the Bulge are particularly rich because the battle was fought at a moment when the American soldiers involved had enough experience to articulate what they were experiencing with the specific clarity that comes from having been through comparable situations before. The men of the 101st who were at Bastogne had been through Normandy and Market Garden. They knew what combat felt like and what being surrounded felt like in the abstract, even if Bastogne was more extreme than anything they had previously faced. The specific oral histories that have been collected from Bastogne veterans, through the Veterans History Project, through the Eisenhower Center at the University of New Orleans, through the specific collections at the National Archives, capture a range of experiences that the famous narrative of the battle tends to compress into a single story of defiant heroism. The defiance was real. The heroism was real. But the experience of the individual soldiers was varied, and the full picture requires acknowledging the fear alongside the courage, the exhaustion alongside the will, the specific human responses to conditions of extreme pressure that are not always heroic in the simple sense. Men describe the cold with consistency that suggests it was the dominant physical experience of siege, more prominent in memory, more immediately threatening to survival, than the German forces that were the nominal subject of the battle. The cold is described in terms that are specific and visceral. The specific pain of frostbitten feet, the specific difficulty of operating weapons with hands that had lost feeling, the specific challenge of maintaining the alertness that a military perimeter required when the body's entire instinct was to conserve heat through immobility. The men also describe McAuliffe with a consistency that reflects a specific approach to command. He was visible. He traveled the perimeter. He ate with his men. He was honest about the situation without being defeatist, telling his soldiers the truth about what the encirclement meant and what it required without telling them to give up. The specific trust that he generated and that allowed the garrison to function as a coherent fighting force through 8 days of siege is the human content of the famous word, the context that makes the word credible rather than simply theatrical. Nuts was credible because the men who received it knew their commander had assessed the situation and had decided that holding was right. They had enough experience of his judgment over the preceding days of the siege to trust that the judgment was sound. A nuts from a commander they did not trust, from a man who had not been visible at the perimeter and had not told them the truth about the situation, would have been theatrical rather than credible. McAuliffe's nuts meant something because McAuliffe had made it mean something in the 8 days before the German emissaries arrived, by being the commander his men needed him to be. The broader lessons that the Bastogne story teaches about military leadership are the lessons that this series has tried to illuminate in each of its 20 episodes. The famous moment is the distillation of a sustained quality. The famous word is the expression of something that was built before the word was spoken. The specific person who said the word is the product of a specific history and a specific set of choices about character, about command style, about the relationship between commander and the men who carry out his decisions. McAuliffe had been building toward the nuts moment for his entire career without knowing it. The specific qualities that allowed him to make the right call, the calm under pressure, the genuine assessment of the military situation rather than the emotional reaction, the specific trust in the men he commanded, were qualities that had been developed over years of military service, and that the specific crisis of Bastogne had called on in exactly the way those qualities were designed to be called on. He gave the right answer. His men held the perimeter. Patton came. The corridor was opened. The battle continued. The war was won. And the word, one syllable, written on a plain sheet of paper by a half-awake general on a December morning, became part of the permanent vocabulary of American military courage. Not because of the word itself, which is not inherently heroic, but because of what the word expressed and what the men who heard it did in response to it. Nuts! The substance behind the symbol was the garrison in the snow. The symbol expressed a substance with a precision that 80 years of subsequent commentary has not improved on. The specific place where the series ends, with the soldiers in the snow at Bastogne, is not accidental. It is the appropriate ending for a series that has tried, across 20 episodes, to look beneath the famous names and the famous moments to find the specific human beings whose specific qualities determine the outcome of the most destructive conflict in human history. The Second World War was fought by millions of people in places most of them had never heard of before the war sent them there. It was decided by decisions made in rooms they had never been in, by commanders they had never met, on the basis of intelligence they did not know existed, at costs they were paying with their lives, without always knowing why those costs were required. The series has tried to make some of this visible, to show the specific intelligence decisions that shaped the battles, the specific personalities that made the decisions, the specific costs that were paid and by whom. It has not been comprehensive. 20 episodes cannot comprehend the full truth of a war that lasted 6 years and killed 70 million people. But it's tried to be honest, to tell the truth about each specific episode rather than the simplified version, to acknowledge the costs alongside the achievements, to see the commanders as human beings rather than as symbols. The commanders were human beings. They were brilliant and flawed and under pressure, and sometimes wrong, and sometimes right in ways they could not fully know when they were being right. Eisenhower wrote a note in his pocket before D-Day acknowledging the possibility of failure. Nimitz trusted a code that his own service had declared unreliable. McAuliffe wrote nuts and went back to sleep. These are human moments, not heroic abstractions. The soldiers were human beings too. The men in the foxholes at Bastogne were cold and tired and scared and low on ammunition, and surrounded by a German army that was asking them to surrender. They held their positions because that is what soldiers do when they've been well-led and well-trained, and they trust the situation and the people responsible for it. They held because McAuliffe had built the conditions that allowed them to hold, and because Patton was coming, and because the specific qualities that the Army had developed in them over months of training and combat were being called on in exactly the way those qualities were designed to be called on. And when the corridor was open and Patton's tanks came through and the siege was broken, they kept fighting, because the war was not over and the enemy was still in front of them, and the specific qualities that had carried them to the siege were still required for months of fighting that remained. That is who they were. That is what they did. And that is the final word of the series. Not nuts, though nuts is exactly the right word for what it was expressing. The final word of this series is the soldiers, the specific, individual, irreplaceable human beings who fought the Second World War and who paid for the decisions of the commanders and the policies of the governments and the intelligence of the code breakers and production of the arsenal of democracy with the specific currency of their lives and their health and their years. They deserve the full truth of what they did and what it cost them. This series has tried to provide some of it. The work is never done. The truth is always larger than what any single telling can contain. But this is where this telling ends. The soldiers in the snow at Bastogne. The men who held the perimeter because the situation required it, and because their general had told them the truth about what holding required. The men whose specific qualities, courage, discipline, trust in each other and in their commander, made the nuts response more than words. The word was one syllable. The holding was 8 days. The cost was real, and the soldiers paid it. That is the Nuts War. That is Bastogne, and that is where the series ends.